In the early decades of the 20th century, the Japanese-American population soared. There are over 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the West Coast by the beginning of World War II.
We interrupt this program to bring you a special news bulletin. The Japanese have attacked Pearl Harbor, Hawaii by air.
On the morning of December 7, 1941, the United States was attacked. The Japanese First Air Fleet undertook a surprise attack on the U.S. naval station at Pearl Harbor in the territory of Hawaii at 7:48 local time. In a flash, America was at war.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
After the dust of Pearl Harbor settled, President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. The executive order created an exclusion zone for the Japanese Americans on the West Coast, who now had to evacuate their homes in as little as 1 week. Japanese Americans would now be sent via railways to several different internment camps across the country. Milton Eisenhower, director of the War Relocation Authority, created a government propaganda film that stated that it was necessary to transfer several thousand Japanese residents from the Pacific coast to points in the American interior. 2/3 of the Japanese Americans were U.S. citizens, but their ancestry linked them to the people that had just attacked them. This pairing would couple these innocent Americans with the Japanese, who were now public enemy number one in the U.S. Milton Eisenhower's film only enhanced this with the phrasing that was used throughout.
We knew that some among them were potentially dangerous. Most were loyal. But no one knew what would happen among this concentrated population if Japanese forces should try to invade our shores.
This narrative is what the U.S. government used to justify the forced relocation of thousands of American citizens. People who were forced to relocate from the San Francisco Bay Area made their way to Delta, Utah. The camp in Delta, known as Topaz, was in the middle of the desert. The major newspapers in Utah, the Deseret News and the Salt Lake Tribune, spoke very little on the Topaz camp, with only Deseret News posting a story on the opening of the relocation camp. The camp was now home to more than 8,000 people. It was the 5th largest city in Utah. But there seemed to be little news coverage during the initial relocation of the residents. The local newspaper, the Millard County Chronicle, served the county where Delta and Topaz were located. It often published stories about Topaz and the people that lived there. The newspaper chronicled the first birth, the killing of resident James Wakasa by a camp guard, and the closing of Topaz in late 1945. Issei, first-generation immigrants from Japan, and Nisei, the children of the Issei, made up most of the people who lived in Topaz. While Issei were not allowed and too old to fight, the younger Nisei were still expected to fight for the United States, despite being held in camps by the same government they were fighting for. Roughly 1 year after being moved out of their homes and into the camps, the Nisei were asked to volunteer for the war. Many of the Nisei men were willing to volunteer to show their patriotism to the country that was interning them.
I'm from Seattle. After war was declared, I was evacuated from the Pacific coast. When the call came for volunteers for a combat team, I volunteered from a relocation center to show my loyalty and to prove that I had the right to live as a good American citizen.
On June 14, 1942, the 100th Infantry Battalion was created. This battalion was made up exclusively of 1,400 Nisei soldiers. In February 1943, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was activated. This unit comprised over 4,000 Nisei soldiers, some of whom volunteered from Hawaii. Others were from the relocation sites scattered across the western United States. The 442nd and the 100th both spent 1943 training at Camp Shelby in Mississippi. The 442nd would join the 100th in the Mediterranean as they fought in the Italian campaign. The two battalions would spend the next several months fighting together in southern Europe, in suicide-like missions, until the 100th integrated into the 442nd in August of 1944. The unit would continue fighting in extremely dangerous combat missions in France and Italy until the end of the war.
Important and decisive battles. And each time, these men of the 100th Infantry Battalion and the 442nd Combat Team have been right out in front.
The spring of 1945 saw the devastating war come to an end. On May 8, 1945, Nazi Germany unconditionally surrendered to Allied forces. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered after atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war was over, and the soldiers of the 442nd could come home. The unit was deactivated and demobilized in August of 1946.
Regimental colors are brought forward to receive the 8th Presidential Unit Citation held by the 442nd.
After the years of fighting, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated in American history for its size and service length. With many Japanese Americans incarcerated in Utah in Topaz, one could wonder what the local news media thought of those soldiers and how they were portrayed. Utah newspapers largely portrayed the Japanese American soldiers in a positive light. Speaking to their accomplishments, the newspapers shined a light on the rewards and accolades the 100th and 442nd Battalions received during their time in combat. These awards included 1,000 Purple Hearts, 44 Silver Stars, 31 Bronze Stars, and 3 Legion of Merit medals.
There are 3,600 Purple Hearts in this outfit, earned in the bitter battles of Salerno and Anzio.
The units were also known for their record of 0 desertions or absences from the unit without leave. The 442nd and 100th received plenty of praise for their actions and bravery during the war, but not everything was positive. One of the biggest problems that the newspapers ran into was the continued racial discrimination that the soldiers would face. The use of slurs when talking about the soldiers harkened back to when they were being removed from their homes into the internment camps. With headlines that read, "Soldiers of Jap ancestry honored," as well as "Utah Japs," and quotes that talk about them as the enemy alien. The Army, on the assumption that any man who wants to fight can be a good soldier, of course, the enemy aliens are checked and double-checked before they are admitted for enlistment. It becomes clear that the same racist and hateful rhetoric from the times right after Pearl Harbor had still managed to seep into the coverage of the Japanese American soldiers that were risking their lives to defend America.
These men are also aware of the great prejudice against them because of the war in the Pacific. They know that there are people back home who make no distinction between them and the Japs we have fought at Tarawa, at Saipan, and the Philippines.
You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won.
This racism was so casual that even in the Eisenhower government film, the Japanese Americans' loyalties are questioned as what they would do if Japan were to invade. This racism was absent from one space that became an easy source to find information on the Nisei soldiers, the Utah Nippo. This newspaper was published in Japantown and Salt Lake City. Utah Nippo, unsurprisingly, had the best portrayal of the soldiers, while the other larger organizations fell into racist wording and portrayals, even if unintentional. Utah Nippo showed the soldiers as what they were, Americans bravely fighting for their country, rather than as enemy aliens proving their allegiance. They portrayed them as exactly what they were, Americans, who happened to be of Japanese ancestry. Slurs and racism were absent. Only positives of those serving would be shown and celebrating their service. The Nisei did not stop being soldiers once the war ended. They continued to be honored for their service once they returned to the United States. The 442nd was deactivated in 1946.
All are Americans of Japanese descent. So too is the rest of this audience, which here listens with solemn pride as the Army honors their sacred dead, Japanese American soldiers killed in action.
These too are Americans, and they've proved it with the full measure of their loyalty. They too fought during those 9 bitter days. They too brought back their wounded. They too brought back their dead.
At the beginning of World War II, young Japanese American citizens had 2 options: move to relocation camps far from your home, or join the army. For those that chose the military, their allegiance would still be tested. Their portrayal within the Utah media was filled with their accolades they had received from their bravery fighting in some of the toughest, most intense fighting in Europe. Also on display is the casual racism that many of the statewide newspapers published. Slurs and bigotry riddled the headlines and stories involving Japanese American soldiers. While a lot of the racism can be attributed to the times, it shows the way that these brave soldiers were seen by a majority of their white peers. Some papers, like the Japanese-run Utah Nippo, did a great job at showing the accomplishments that the unit had, while never questioning their loyalties or comparing them to the enemy. Other Utah newspapers praised the Japanese American troops. On the day after Christmas, 1946, the Park Record published the thoughts of Henry F. May, Jr. He wrote, "Nisei soldiers give the Japanese perhaps the finest available object lesson in democracy. These Nisei seem to many Japanese a sufficient proof that America means what she says about democracy."